Okay, good morning, good afternoon and evening as usual for the WFA. We're delighted to welcome many of you from multiple time zones today. A very warm welcome. Just to preempt a couple of questions that we often get asked, yes, we will be able to share a copy of this presentation with you after the session, and we'll also make a recording of the webinar available for you to share with those of your colleagues who weren't able to make it today. Looking forward to having you with us for just under an hour today. Please keep in mind that this is designed to be an interactive session, so you should be seeing a Q&A widget on your page. Please feel free to post your questions as they come to mind, and myself and Annie will pose them to our presenter today at the end during the Q&A session, which will allow plenty of time. Now, the focus of today is going to be an area which resonates in pretty much every market and region in which we're active. And in fact, every one of the 58 National Advertiser Association members we have around the world, and I'm noticing amongst others we've got the Canadians on today. I know this is a topic that's going to be very high on the priorities for their members. And also, of course, for the 80 company members and the logos that you see in front of you now, would agree it's a top topic. So ICP, IMC, comms, planning, call it whatever you will. It has many names, but what we're focusing on today is integrated marketing communications. And our members have been telling us for some time and regularly reminding us that integration remains a key challenge for them. And that's one of the reasons why we set up our IMC forum, which you see a picture of here from a fairly recent meeting hosted by Coca-Cola in London. And the reason we established this group was to help our members to learn from one another in relation to how to overcome common barriers, for example, internal and external silos, and basically towards delivering more effective integrated marketing solutions. And since its inception, this group now meets on 3 continents, including in London, Singapore, and on the 22nd of September, so later this month, for the first time in Miami, where we've been doing events in LATAM previously in Mexico, but this is our first time there. So for those of you who weren't aware and would be interested to join or have colleagues based in Latin America who would like to join us, please just drop Annie or myself a line. We'll include our contact details at the end of this presentation. In fact, our guest speaker today had something of a hand in the development of this group. Will Collin, who you see on the right here, is a co-founder of Naked Communications, and Naked really helped us to launch that forum, which Annie and I, who will be facilitating this webinar today, still manage today. And together with our friends at Coca-Cola and Anheuser-Busch, amongst others, Naked also helped us to create our IMC scorecard, which is an online tool you should be seeing in front of you. And those of you interested in using it, there's a URL on the left-hand side. It's basically an online tool designed to help members understand how they're performing in relation to their readiness for IMC, for integrated marketing communications, basically by benchmarking themselves against a unique pool of multinational marketers. So in completing the scorecard, members rate their performance against many different aspects of the IMC process. And in creating the scorecard with Naked, we sort of identified many different aspects or steps, if you like. So many, in fact, that we ended up grouping them into 3 buckets, as you see here. So people, meaning your internal colleagues and your external partners, i.e. agencies. The process, so the bespoke steps and principles that you put in place within your organization. And finally, and we tend to hear from you, the most challenging performance, so understanding the return, the ROI, and more from your integrated marketing investment. So now, whilst this isn't the focus of today's presentation, here you see a snapshot of the overview of recent responses from that scorecard. And I've just focused on one of those 3 buckets I mentioned. This one is process. The reason I'm sharing these results is not really to go into any great detail, but is really just to give you a sense of the many different aspects in the process and the potential complexity involved. In this area, some of the most challenging, or the most important and most challenging areas tend to be around consumer insight, generating big ideas, etc. But the reason I'm showing you this is really just to show the potential complexity involved. This is just one of the three areas that we're talking about. So comms planning, frankly, isn't what it used to be, and for many of our members, increasingly this has become something of a science. But if we pause for a minute and just say, is this drive for sophistication that we're all working together to improve, have we actually sort of lost sight, if you like, of the most important stakeholder? Meaning the people we're trying to connect with, engage with, and ultimately sell our products and services to. So keeping that in mind, I said this was going to be an interactive session. I'd like to just pause for a moment and turn it over to you. And we're going to launch a poll. And Annie, if you wouldn't mind just throwing up that first survey for our members. For those of you who are new to these webinars, when it appears on your screen, simply click on the answer that you think most relates to you. So the question is, on the whole, how would you say people, meaning consumers, generally feel about the commercial communications they are exposed to? So do you think they're generally extremely positive, mostly positive, or are you neutral on it, you're not really sure, or are they mostly negative or extremely negative? So we'll let this one run for a while. As I said, while you're voting for that, please, at any point during this webinar, post your questions in the Q&A widget. Feel free to ask questions. If Annie can respond immediately, she will. Otherwise, we'll put them to Will at the end of this session. So, okay, how's that looking? So, quite a mixed response that we're getting right now. So 28% of you saying mostly positive. The largest share saying mostly negative, which is pretty interesting. And the balance being unsure about it. So quite a spread there. Now, the reason I raise this, I think, is this is an area which really brings us to the focus, if you like, of this webinar. Some of you may be aware of a WFA initiative called Project Reconnect, and it's very much focused on this topic, is around the sort of disconnect, if you like, between brands and consumers. So according to SIBO, 80% of brands, so marketers like you, believe that they deliver great consumer experiences. When they ask people, consumers, only 8% of them agree. So pretty sure you'd agree that there's some sort of disconnect going on here, and many of you will be aware of Havas's Meaningful Brands, which arguably takes this even further and saying that not only are our communications often unwelcome, but the brands that they promote have in many cases pretty much become meaningless. So the majority of people worldwide wouldn't care if 73% of brands disappeared tomorrow. And this apparent disconnect is really the reason why we wanted to put Will in front of you today. Today's presentation isn't going to be a how-to session. Actually, moreover, I'd say it's a how we might do session. And over the next 30 to 45 minutes, you'll be exposed to, we think, some fascinating thinking from a person we, and I know many of our members, really respect and admire. So with that, we'd like to hand over to Will Collin now and say a very warm welcome back to the WFA, Will.
Thanks very much, Rob, and I hope everyone can hear me clearly. I've called this presentation The Future of Communications Planning, and that's because I'm going to talk about what I think communication planning needs to change into to be valuable for marketers in the future. But to talk about the future, I think we have to look at its past and its present, and to understand how we got to where we are, and to understand the state that we're currently in before drawing any conclusions about where to go next. And let's be clear, when I say communication planning, rather like Rob introduced at the very beginning, communication planning is a discipline within strategic planning, which is in many ways the primary technique that we use to deliver the overall integrated marketing communication process. So although I'm using the phrase comms planning, when we speak about comms planning, we necessarily also speak about IMC, I believe. So past, present and future. Let's start in chronological order, taking a little trip down memory lane. And let's just for a moment recap how we got to where we are. And as many of you, as everybody, in fact, not many of you, as everybody knows, the origins of comms planning lie in the discipline that was traditional media planning, although at the time we just called it media planning. We didn't know it was traditional at that point. Now, in hindsight, we call it traditional media planning, which was basically the process of maximizing bang for your buck, a simple analytical technique to analyze the reach of a given media vehicle, the cost of buying impacts within that media vehicle, and then identifying the optimum blend of investment across different media vehicles to maximize the number of impacts for your defined target market segment. In a way, it was a kind of arithmetical exercise, quite a self-contained problem, and it was in an age when media was supposedly, at least if you talk to some of its critics in creative departments, media was a world of gorillas with calculators. The gorilla element obviously relating to the hard negotiations with media owners. Now, I'm fortunate in being now old enough within the industry to have worked at a time when we still had full service agencies. So my very first graduate job was in an agency where the media department was part of the main agency. I did my graduate training in each department, including the media department. So I kind of saw it very up close. And just as an aside, I later left that agency to join a media independent, even though my original job wasn't in media, it was as an account planner. But the age of the gorilla with the calculator was the world of traditional media planning, and it was it fulfilled its remit perfectly, and the world was a simpler place then. So the problems we were asking to solve were easier in hindsight, but that's not to say, of course, there's anything wrong with that. It was just the thinking was developed to the standard it needed to be. Now, the world of media kept moving, partly driven, in no small part driven by the media independents, who started to bring creativity into media planning, the use of innovative techniques within existing media channels, the creation of new media channels, where the value of the environment surrounding the message was recognized, not simply the number of eyeballs that channel could deliver. And I guess that led to some really interesting campaigns, and those were celebrated in various media award schemes, which started to proliferate in the late 1990s. But by the year 2000, a convenient round number to mark a change in attitude, I think everyone could see very clearly that the world had changed, and the change primarily was that of fragmentation. And that was the subject of the day back in the turn of the millennium, when everyone was concerned about the number of TV channels on digital, the number of magazines and radio stations proliferating. Yes, we did talk about that. And of course, the arrival of the commercial application of the internet, and Google was only a year or two old in 2000. Another point that was also being recognized around that time was that media, the phrase that we used, actually was a synonym for paid for communication. It wasn't used in its real sense, which is any means of linking a consumer to a brand, because it forgot about lots of the stuff that you didn't pay for, at least you didn't pay for through a media agency. So that's everything from packaging to customer service through call centers or face-to-face, through to advocacy and PR and all those things. So what we found around the time of 2000, a sense that the traditional approach, and we could now see it was traditional, wasn't adequately capturing the needs of brands at that time. And that's what led to the arrival, I suppose, of comms planning, a solution to the complexity and fragmented world that we now inhabited. And that's the time that my company first began, but I don't want to claim ownership of this idea. This was an idea that the industry discovered for itself. It was just struggling to find ways of making sense of it and of acting upon it. This was a time when I think it became clear that everything communicates. In other words, every element of a business, not simply those bits that we call marketing communications, every bit of the business's operations in some way influence people's perceptions and influence the way that brands succeed or don't succeed. And the recognition was that a successful brand was one that created a distinctive voice that was reflected across all the encounters between itself and its target market. And here you see an example of a hotel chain that realized that those little bottles of shampoo or shower gel in the bathroom are a media channel just as much as the print ads or the direct mail shops or whatever. So that was around the year 2000 and the beginning, I suppose, of comms planning. And the interesting thing, one of the many interesting things about comms planning and about IMC is a recognition that the role of a channel isn't simply as a conduit for a message to the audience. It isn't just a source of eyeballs. All channels are not equal, and they're different because they play different roles, because those channels reflect a different point of connection, a different moment in the consumer's life, or a different point along the consumer's decision-making journey, perhaps. And the role of communications planning, in part, is to orchestrate the combination of channels such that each channel plays to its strengths rather than treating them all as just more or less expensive sources of eyeballs. And there's some great examples of how multi-layered campaigns used different channels to meet the customer's needs, if you like, across the decision-making journey, to help the consumer move from one stage of the journey to the next by giving them the right information or the right influence or creating the right desire to move people ever closer to purchase. And the discipline grew into, I guess, IMC and an entire marketing process. And I guess this became the new normal. What started out as an interesting new idea became the orthodoxy for the industry. And within that orthodoxy, we had a new god to worship, the god of engagement. And everyone will remember how around the mid 2000s, everyone got quite excited about saying, well, it's interruption is so 1990s. Now we're all about engagement. In the old days, advertising just was like a blunt instrument. You just banged people over the head with your message. Whereas now we want consumers to feel like they want to get involved. We want them to participate. We want them to be partners in the process. We want the encounter between the brand and the consumer to be a meaningful one, not just some kind of passive ships passing in the night kind of occasion. And experiential marketing and other kinds of participative techniques really started to be recognized as valuable in that context. Now, engagement as a word, I'm not going to go too much into this, but as we all know, it has subsequently taken on a whole lot of more, I suppose, technical meanings within the world of particularly digital communication, which actually isn't very helpful. Having one word having many meanings is one of the great difficulties in this industry. Not just this word, but several others are used to mean many things by different people. But at the time, I think engagement was being celebrated as a new standard of communication effectiveness. You knew that your campaign was working if consumers chose to get engaged rather than simply let it wash over them. And this was great. I guess, I'm talking here around the mid 2000s. It felt like the communication industry had finally got its act together, had developed a response to fragmentation within media, a methodology that enabled you to deal with the new fragmented world, and in fact also to deal with all the touch points between brand and consumer, not just the paid for channels. But of course, the world beyond our industry wasn't standing still, notably in the proliferation of digital technologies and the uptake of those technologies by mainstream consumers. And I've cherry-picked three different statistics here. That the red line you see shows the overall traffic on the internet globally, so everything, data, video, everything, web pages, etc. The blue line is very specifically Facebook user numbers, and the green line is the global penetration of smartphones, which obviously very much kicks off in 2007 with the launch of the iPhone. If you think about it, year 2006 was kind of the point when things started to turn, starting relatively small, but then you get the hockey stick curve growing very rapidly beyond that date. And what does this mean? Okay, well, we know this has happened. After all, it is 9 years ago. I'd like to say what it means. I'm going to switch to somebody else's voice. Specifically, I'm going to show you a little clip from the TED talk by a professor at the MIT Media Lab, a guy called Joey Ito, who draws quite a neat analogy for the transformation between the world before and the world after the internet.
So remember before the internet? I call this BI, okay? So in BI, life was simple. Things were Euclidean, Newtonian, somewhat predictable. People actually tried to predict the future, even the economists. And then the internet happened, and the world became extremely complex, extremely low cost, extremely fast, and those Newtonian laws that we so dearly cherished turned out to be just local ordinances.
Okay, so he's describing quite a fundamental break, not just an evolution, but a total change from a world of predictability, a world of certainty, a world where you could place your bets and reliably anticipate a return, to a world where things became complex and things became unpredictable. And so the point that I think Joey Ito was making was that once the digital adoption has gone mainstream, once the consumers have the ability to connect at mass scale in very short time scales, but at very low cost, what you have is a vast increase in the number of individual voices that communicate. YouTube's original tagline was "broadcast yourself," and in effect, that's what we have. We have a world broadcasting itself, one person at a time. Not to mention, of course, the brands. And in the connections that those digital technologies created between people, both directly and then more importantly indirectly through peer groups and communities, you have a massive increase in the number of potential routes that any one idea, one concept, one meme can spread and ultimately build to reach a mass audience. It inevitably leads to a much more fluid, chaotic, and unpredictable world where things happen at short notice, can blow out of proportion almost without warning, and equally things can just fall flat. Things that perhaps you might think would have been successful just get blotted out by another cat video or some silly dance that someone has posted. It's a good thing as well. It's led to grassroots consumer journalism. It's led to organization of political groups at the street level, leading to social change. It's led to charitable campaigns that have raised millions of dollars for good causes based simply on a single person making a post online. Everything has become so much frothier, so much more, volatile, as I say here. That graph, by the way, you might be wondering what that funny picture is. I've pasted onto this slide. That's just an example of a model of, I think it's called a logistic map of how, in a system where there are two choices, ultimately the number of potential outcomes can ultimately become almost unbounded and chaotic. And in a way, that reflects the world we now inhabit, where previously we had a limited number of options, we now have virtually an unlimited number of options, and the predictability we once enjoyed, or once at least had a reasonable understanding of, now has been lost. And that means, of course, that scale, that used to be the basis of a reasonable predictor of success, is no longer necessary. The winner doesn't necessarily end up being the guy with the biggest budget, or the most the longest track record, or the greatest established presence in the market. Things can bubble up out of nowhere, and as Justin Bieber discovered to his cost, you see that red line, sort of second line along the page there. That's Justin Bieber's video on YouTube, suddenly getting blasted out of the water by the crazy Gangnam Style out of South Korea. No one saw that coming. Now, I've chosen a very famous example there, but I think if you wanted, you could pick almost endless examples of new ideas, new stories, new personalities, new memes that have sprung up from the shadows and become massively mainstream. And this is the world that the brand inhabits, the world in which attention can be grabbed away from you in an instant, and without any opportunity really to foresee where that was going to come from. So where does that leave comms planning? Well, comms planning, I guess, it was built to solve a different problem. It was built to solve the problem of fragmentation and of capturing all aspects of the brand's voice. It wasn't built to solve the problem of volatility, unpredictability of the world that has since developed. And the centerpiece output, the kind of single chart, if you had to have a single chart out of comms planning that you would cherish beyond all others, is the communication architecture, which shows how the different channels are being combined, being built up in layers to create the consumer's experience across the journey from being out of the category through consideration into preference and purchase and beyond. And one of the I suppose the implied benefits of a comms architecture is it is an architecture. The word chosen deliberately to reflect the plan laid down before you build something of stability and substance. Obviously a building, but applied to communications, it is the predictable creation of an effective campaign strategy. And the assumption is that process is one that you can predict and that you can control as you implement it. But here we are, living in the volatile and frothy world. Rob, were you going to interject something there?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, maybe just to give you a little bit of a breather, that on the point of predictability, maybe we turn it over to everyone who's on this webinar for another just quick poll to get a sort of sense of the pulse, if you like, of our members who are on the webinar right now. So Annie, if you wouldn't mind launching that second poll. This is really just to sort of say, thinking about your own comms planning right now, how confident are you in the outcome? So very confident, somewhat confident, not really sure, not very confident, or not at all confident. So do you think there's no problem, we can actually pretty sure what return we're going to be getting from our own approach, or actually is it completely unpredictable? And so if you could just cast your vote now, and while you're just filling that in, just to remind you, please feel free to post your questions in the Q&A widget that we have there. So, okay, so if we take a snap there, that's quite interesting. Pretty confident bunch on the whole. So 57% of our members saying they're somewhat confident, 0, interestingly, saying very confident, which I suppose is predictable, and the balance are somewhere between not sure and down to not at all confident. So any thoughts on that, Will, as you go through?
Well, I think you could read it two ways. You could say, hey, a majority of us are confident, but you could equally say, given all of the research, all of the resource and all of the expensive talent applied to the process of planning communications, surely you would hope for better than just 56% saying they were confident. So I think you can read it both ways if you're minded to, and I certainly think the fact that a significant minority do indicate an uncertainty in their expected outcomes shows that there is a problem. Perhaps not universal, and perhaps it doesn't apply equally across categories, but I think that is a concern. Now, you might say, advertising and marketing has always been an uncertain game. William Goldman, the Hollywood screenwriter, famously said about writing a hit movie that nobody knows anything. You simply, if you have the right star, the right director, the right producer, the right crew, whatever, you still might get a dud. And you might argue that applies in advertising. But I think now more than ever, predictability is in shorter supply because of the number of unpredictable extraneous factors that can stand between a campaign being launched and it ultimately following through with the results. So thanks for that, Rob. So just to sum up, I think there are two crises that existed within comms planning as we see it today. The first of those two crises is this unpredictability. That's rather attractive picture there is not some funky wallpaper from my office. It's actually a picture of turbulence in liquid flow, and turbulence is a kind of classic example of chaos in action. And in many ways, that reflects the world of the sort of the frothy, unpredictable world in which brand communications has to struggle through to gain the consumer's attention and to achieve its results. It's so much harder to find a line of sight between what the great stuff we do or believe we do in marketing with ultimately how consumers think and feel and how they behave somewhere down the line. Unpredictability, I think the scale of unpredictability is greater than ever. The second, Aaron, I said there are two crises. I'm building towards a second crisis, if you'll bear with me. Is this word engagement? I've come back to it now. Engagement, this great benchmark of success that comms planning really brought to the fore as the ambition for all successful marketing communications. And when we say engagement, what do we mean? Well, increasingly we mean things like liking the brand, following the brand, voting in some sort of poll or competition held by the brand, sharing content created by the brand, even helping to create that very content together with the brand. Lots of ways in which brands are seeking engagement from the consumer, and I think this is problematic, or it has become problematic in the way that we're pursuing engagement. And the reason I think it's problematic is basically that advertising and marketing communications more generally is today and has always been a bargain, as in a value exchange between the brand and the consumer, where the brand offers something to the consumer and the consumer trades something back to the brand. And in the traditional days, I guess that was we rewarded people when they gave us their attention with a little bit of entertainment, and within that entertainment there was a brand message. It was a fairly simple transaction. Both parties knew what they were getting. It was transparent, and it worked pretty well, provided that what was being offered was deemed worthy by the consumer. And that's kind of fairly straightforward exchange, and neither party is asking too much. But increasingly, in pursuit of engagement, because it's possible to invite consumers to become more involved and to ask them to participate to a greater degree in the brand's story, it's a temptation that's hard to resist, to go on and actually invite them to do that, and to request and to nudge them and pressure them into doing that. And I've rather unfairly picked a couple of examples from a few years back, which, in hindsight, I think, wouldn't be repeated. But one example from the world of toilet tissue, where people are invited to share their toilet behaviours in some kind of poll, and another example from a packaged bread brand asking people to confess how it is that they use sliced bread, and how they have their dark secrets that they're being asked to own up to on the web. Now, I think these are perhaps two bad examples, but I'll just pick one personally that's not quite as standout, embarrassing as those two, but nevertheless, in its own way, equally bad. I had an email from TripAdvisor the day before yesterday, and they asked me to get out my phone and record myself for a whole minute, and recount a story of how I have discovered on their site some piece of information about a travel destination that led me to go on to have a fantastic trip, or my best trip ever, and to do it all on camera. And this was for the chance to win a holiday. And I must admit, I just thought, you have got to be joking. I'm not going to sit here and do that. Spend the time thinking up something to say, to a certain degree, risk myself looking a bit of an idiot, because you're never quite sure how you're going to come across. And that's all just for the chance to win a holiday. I think that's just another of many examples that we could find where, because it's possible to ask for engagement, because so many more techniques and channels and technologies are now available where we can ask people to engage, the assumption is that we will ask people to engage. And I think that's what's leading to an imbalance in the bargain that we strike between a brand and a consumer. And let's bear in mind that this is all at a time when there is strong evidence that consumers are becoming increasingly disaffected with advertising. We know, of course, that ad blocking as a technology within the digital world is growing. Tomorrow, anyone with an iPhone or an iPad is potentially going to download the new operating system, which makes ad blocking almost a default in their web experience. And ad blocking is just one part of the wider growth in ad avoidance. So we know that consumers are in many occasions becoming more disaffected with advertising, and yet we're asking them to do so much more. And that, I think, is the second crisis that faces communication planning as a discipline, which is that the value exchange has become unbalanced. Where previously entertainment was traded for attention, now we're delivering entertainment, but we're asking for attention and participation as well. We're asking for more, but we're not necessarily giving back in proportion. So let's revisit the basic principles of value exchange. And this is where I'm going to start talking about where I think the future of communications planning needs to be found. The basic principle of value exchange is, you give, I'll give in return. I won't take from you without offering you something of value in recompense. And it's interesting, this principle, let's call it reciprocity, is something that has been studied a lot in social science. It's been found to be a cultural norm in every society around the world. It's a universal cultural norm for human society. And it came to prominence when, at the beginning of the 20th century, some anthropologists went to visit far-flung remote communities who were pretty much isolated from some of the more mainstream developed nations, where some of the traditional behaviours still persisted. And one of these communities was in Melanesia, where there are lots of island communities separated by bodies of water, who had very strong, curiously strong social structures and hierarchies, and strong relationships between individuals, and both within communities and between communities on different islands. And it turns out that those strong relationships were being established and sustained by this rather curious exchange process that was called the cooler ring. Now, cooler is a kind of a trinket, a kind of an object of symbolic value, such as a conch shell necklace or something like that. And what was happening in these communities was that people were making journeys, often quite dangerous journeys, across large expanses of water by boat in order to trade and exchange these objects, the valuable objects, not because it was a kind of marketplace where people were making money and gaining financial value. It was all about social value. It was about esteem. By giving someone a gift of symbolic value, you gain esteem and you gain a bond with that individual, such that individual then becomes obliged in some way to return the favor back to you. And this is like a tangible example, a rare tangible example of the social process of reciprocity that was discovered by chance almost in the last century. And I think it's interesting because it shows that the gift giving part is so central to that connection that then establishes between the community members. So what this leads me to identify is that what is central in communications is this goal of reciprocity. It's reciprocity that represents the most effective connection between a brand and consumer, just as it reflects the strongest relationship builder between two people in real life. It's not engagement. It's not asking people to knuckle down and get involved and start doing stuff for the brand and on behalf of the brand. It's actually to give something of value if we ever expect to get something back in return, even if that something is simply a moment's attention. And in fact, as this slide here says on the right, was give more than you take. Being that we live in the world of commerce and brands, we almost have to over-deliver, given the general level of cynicism that often exists within consumers these days. So the success that we seek will depend on our being seen to be being generous with the value that we provide through communication, not simply to get the consumer to jump through a series of hoops in the hope that represents a more engaged audience. And what's interesting, actually, looking back over recent history in marketing, there have been a number of techniques that have sprung up as the new exciting thing, whether it's gamification, branded utility, experiential marketing, brand content. All of these techniques, I think if you look through the lens of reciprocity, you can see them all as different approaches to doing the same thing, essentially, of offering greater value to the audience from the process of marketing communications, recognizing that we are placing a burden on people whenever we ask them to notice our ad or do anything beyond just notice our ad. We're asking them to give something to us, and we have to offer value in return. And I think in different ways the industry's been reaching around for ways of providing that. Maybe we didn't use the word reciprocity, but I think you can see that these are all in their own way different mechanisms for reciprocating value to consumers. But we've never really defined it as such, actually, communication planning should not be the process of maximizing the engagement of the consumer. I think that places all the burden in the consumer's lap. We're asking the consumer to engage. That's us placing demands on the audience. It's the wrong starting point philosophically. The right starting point is to say, what can the brand offer? What value can we create for the consumer that is sufficient to inspire the behaviors that we seek from the consumer, to inspire the willingness to participate, the willingness to grant us a little of their precious attention and their time. So to draw this to a conclusion, for me, seeing I've got this sort of slightly now privileged viewpoint of over 25 years, 26 years in the industry, from the full service agency through to media independence, and now through to the sort of multi-agency, multi-discipline world that we have these days, to see that it is the creation of value, the reciprocation of value for an audience spans both the conception of the idea, the process that leads to the conception of the idea, and the process that leads to the definition of how to deploy that idea, the distribution of that idea, the connection plan for the consumer. Now you might say, well, are you advocating a return to the full service agency? And I'm not advocating that. I don't think this is necessarily a structural point. It is a point about the process wherein the idea and the distribution or the delivery of that idea needs to be conceived together, because ultimately the thing which you are looking to create isn't the big idea, nor is it the most successfully integrated comms plan. It is value for the audience. The goal is to create value from the audience, because only by creating value for the audience will you ever can you ever expect to get any participation or attention back from the consumer. So let's just finish with a checklist, a 3-point checklist for delivering reciprocity. First point: some of you will be familiar with Robert Cialdini, who wrote a book called, I'm gonna misquote his title now, something like this, the Psychology of Persuasion, or something like. Anyway, he had a view. He had 6 principles of persuasion, and his first principle was reciprocity, which someone had to point that out to me, that reciprocity is something that Robert Cialdini had himself advocated. But the interesting, if you read Cialdini, he draws out a particular point, which is that reciprocity, the mechanism operates most strongly when something is given without initially getting anything in return. If you like, the generosity is what triggers the reciprocal response. So in this instance, in the world of marketing communications, we need to think, how can our brand be generous? How can we go out of our way to give value to the consumer without it being so immediately and intrinsically linked with the consumers returning that value in the very same moment? So how can the brand be generous with its value? That's the first point on the checklist. The second point, looking at it from the other angle, looking at it from the consumer's angle, if we're seeking engagement, if we are creating a campaign in which the consumer is expected to engage, we've got to ask ourselves, what is the scale of the burden that engagement requires? How much work are we actually asking them to do? And is that realistic? Is it realistic? Is it reasonable for us to place this level of demand on the audience? And the Cannes Lion Award this year, I read quite a lot of critiques of many of the winners. And the point being made by some of the critics was that it feels like all too often great ideas, big ideas as celebrated by the industry, are considered great and big without reference to the degree to which they actually reflect the realities of ordinary people's daily lives, and that they might involve some clever application of a new technology or some interesting kind of technique that rather cleverly applies different aspects of channels and marketing, but without really thinking about what's in it for the consumer and why would they care. And I think, in some ways, to champion reciprocity over engagement is to champion the consumer over the marketing process, and always to start with the question, well, why would the consumer care? Why would they even bother to take part? And the final point on my checklist, point 3, let's remember, when we talk about the reciprocation of value, value can come in many forms, and usually it's not tangible. So that TripAdvisor instance, that email where it offered me the chance to win a holiday, well, that's kind of tangible value, but so much more powerful than offering cash or its equivalents are things like esteem, social currency, the opportunity to feel part of a cause that you believe in, the opportunity to connect with people who matter to you, the opportunity to satisfy your own desire for knowledge and expertise and connoisseurship within a given category or a given field. Those are kinds of areas where we can create value for the consumer through marketing communications really effectively. This isn't an agenda for sales promotion, let's be very clear. I'm not talking about that sort of exchange of value. It's an agenda for more effective communications. With that, I think I'll come to a close, and I think, Rob, you were going to host the Q&A.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks a lot for that, Will. I mean, from my perspective, at least, I think it's really valuable to sort of have that chronology and sort of learning from your experience over, I think you called it a quarter of a century to me yesterday, which sounded much more alarming than 25 years. But anyway, I mean, I think we were our CMO forum in Cannes earlier this year, and a lot of the CMOs there were sort of saying, we've been talking about consumer centricity for a really long time, but how many companies genuinely hand on heart can say that they've taken a consumer centric approach? So, with that in mind, personally, I find this a really sort of fascinating and exciting thinking, and a pretty new thinking. So thank you very much for sharing that. We've got a few questions that have come through from our members here, if you don't mind. One of them, which I think I did say at the start of this session, this wasn't a how-to. It was more of how we might do, if you like. So, no shame, I think, if you can't sort of say this is exactly the solution. But someone's popped in the chat function, how do we reconcile that the value isn't tangible when we're constantly expected to measure and quantify the return of our comms activity? So, amongst our members, ROI always ranks number one in terms of understanding of return on investment as a sort of priority. So, how can you sort of get your colleagues and your key stakeholders behind this approach when you say, actually, it's not tangible, it's not really measurable? And any thoughts on that at all?
Yeah, I think that's perhaps I wasn't being clear enough. When I say that the value isn't tangible, I mean the value that is offered to the consumer in the process of communication. You don't have to buy their attention or their engagement or their involvement through, win a prize, get cash back, here's a discount code if you like us on Facebook. That's what I meant by it doesn't have to be tangible. You don't have to offer tangible incentives to trigger the reciprocation. Yeah, and as I said, actually, it's often something as intangible as self-esteem or a sense of belonging. Those are the things that often trigger that sense of reciprocation.
So harder to measure the value exchange rather than the outcome. I understand. So and some
for the brand owner, but it doesn't mean that the input has to be tangible to the consumer.
Got it. Absolutely. Another one here is this might just be a yes or no, actually, saying, so does this mean that engagement is the future of comms planning, but reciprocity becomes a means and an ends to deliver against engagement?
Well, funny, I think engagement is still an oversold concept. Possibly, I may be partly guilty in having oversold it or contributed to its overselling at an earlier stage in my life. And for those of us who've had the great pleasure of reading How Brands Grow by Byron Sharp, we'll know that there is a school of thought which says that success in marketing is down to the maximization of mental and physical availability, and the role of communications essentially deals with the first part of that, mental availability, simple recognition and salience, and arguably to achieve salience or memorability, you don't really need a great deal of engagement. You simply need to be visible. And now I'm not sure, I don't think the case has been proven that is a truth that applies to all brands in all circumstances, but I certainly think it probably does apply to some brands in some circumstances, and therefore I would say engagement is valuable, and probably more valuable for brands where the act of becoming a customer is quite high touch or involves where service is part of the process of being a customer. I think maybe for more transactional brands, then maybe that's less the case, and engagement is less necessary. Actually, simple familiarity and salience may suffice. So I think engagement as the be all and end all for all kinds of marketing isn't the ultimate goal. I think reciprocity is certainly a means of achieving engagement, and I think the question is absolutely valid in that respect. But engagement isn't always, to my mind at least, the goal that we should be seeking. I think that value exchange of a few seconds of entertainment for a few milliseconds of attention still holds true in some cases.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. And just a final question, which has been asked by several members. I mean, this is obviously new thinking, but do you have any sort of examples / case studies or companies you think are really, doing a great job here? And then a secondary one is, and how, which is obviously a much bigger one to answer, which perhaps we could do as a follow-up to everyone who's on this. But any sort of companies off the top of your head you think, actually, yes, they're nailing this right now?
Yeah, I can only point to campaigns rather than I don't have insight necessarily into the processes used to arrive at those campaigns, but campaigns which I feel embody the principle of reciprocity. One I'll name, which may not be familiar widely. I'm not sure. It may only be a UK campaign, so forgive me. I will describe it. It's by a dairy brand owned by Arla Foods, which is a Danish dairy business. A brand's called Lurpak. It's basically butter. It's kind of butter, yellow fats market in the UK. And their campaign, which has now been running successfully for, I think, the best part of a decade, basically plays the role of taking very ordinary, everyday kinds of food that you might serve or prepare with butter, and elevating them from their ordinary, everyday reality to something more akin to a heroic, kind of high status form of food, really heroing the everyday to raise it up to a kind of absolutely beautiful level. It's kind of food porn, to use that rather unpleasant phrase. And I think that's a great example of every aspect of that communication is lavishly produced. The visual feel of it is rich and beautiful, and it's a very simple value exchange. There's not much being asked for on the part of the consumer. This is traditional advertising, but it recognizes that you need to reward the attention of the consumer with something that leaves them feeling hungry. Basically, it's mouth-watering, quite literally. It evokes that sense of deliciousness, and I think that does reward the attention of the consumer. That's kind of traditional advertising example. I think perhaps a slightly less traditional example, it's more in the world of branded content, which I think in many cases is a field that provides reciprocity when done well, is the Volvo Trucks work, which I know has been celebrated in various awards, festivals, the live test series, where they're essentially product demonstration films, but blown out of all proportion, delivered in the most sort of eye-catching or surprising way, and it's business-to-business marketing, really, but done with a wit and an intelligence and a level of real attention to detail that rewards the viewer way beyond what you might expect in that category. So that again is reciprocating. It's delivering so much to the audience that you're inviting the audience to be drawn into the brand and to feel a more positive response.
No, brilliant. I think we. No, that's great. Thank you. I mean, maybe if you're willing, we might be able to work together to come up. I mean, those are actually both WFA members, happily, but maybe we could sort of pull together a few examples to share with the people who are on this webinar as a sort of follow-up, if you like. But that's a great starter. So I'm going to draw this to a close, if you don't mind, Will. For those of you who are interested in joining the IMC forum, as you've seen in front of you, we've got a few dates coming up, notably 22nd of September in Miami. Let us know if you'd like to come along. And just finally, any additional questions, please send them to us. We'd be happy to pass them on to Will and get him to contact you directly. It just remains for me to say thank you very much again, Will, for sharing your thinking in this area, which again, as I say, we think is fascinating. And finally, thank you very much to all the WFA members for joining us today. So thank you.
Thanks, Rob.